Hi there. I'm Jill Pompi, and I'm excited to spend the next 45 minutes or so sharing information about the importance of vocabulary instruction in the classroom, beginning in the earliest of grades and continuing into high school and beyond. Much of the information included is based on the information from the National Center on Improving Literacy and the work of Isabel Beck, Margaret McCune, and Linda Kukan, along with Michael Graves. A lot of what I share can be found in the book Bringing Words to Life, first published back in 2005. And everything we talk about will support all learners, including multilingual learners. But first, a little bit about me. Currently, I am working as a faculty member, an adjunct faculty member at Bay Path University, teaching two courses, one focusing on comprehension of narrative and nonfiction text, and the other focusing on approaches and practices for writing instruction and assessment. I have many years of experience in the world of education as classroom teacher, reading specialist, literacy coach, Title I director, director of curriculum and instruction, building principal, and also literacy consultant. And I'm happy to say that my consulting work allows me to travel around the country meeting talented educators just like yourselves from whom I can learn. Now, back to vocabulary and why are we focusing on vocabulary? Well, there are 5 essential components to literacy instruction that were first identified back in the early 2000s by the National Reading Panel, and they are still considered key in all of the science of reading research that we have today. Vocabulary is one of those 5 components. In addition, when we think about the work by Scarborough and examine Scarborough's rope, we notice that one side focuses on word reading and the prerequisite skills to decoding, and the other side focuses on comprehension. And of course, we see vocabulary as an important part of comprehending text. As a matter of fact, we know that we can spend all day teaching reading strategies and skills, but if a child does not have both background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge, their comprehension will be compromised. So what can a teacher do? Well, we can focus on vocabulary instruction. Isabel Beck talks about the importance of vocabulary when thinking about reading comprehension, and she states that a robust approach to teaching vocabulary includes directly explaining the meaning of words with thought-provoking, playful, and interactive follow-up. Learning vocabulary words should be fun and engaging, and I happen to think it's one of the most fun things that we do in the classroom. Before we get started, let's have a little fun by testing your knowledge of the English language. How many words do you think are listed in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the most complete lexicon of the English language? If you guessed around 600,000 words, you would be correct. Now, how many words do you think the average college-educated adult will recognize the meanings of while they're reading? Well, according to Susie Dent, the average active vocabulary of an adult English speaker is around 20,000 words, while his passive vocabulary is closer to 40,000 words. Now, we can understand 40,000 words through reading and listening far more than the number of words that we're able to use in our expressive vocabulary. We need to own a word a little bit more fully to use it in our speaking and our writing. How many words do you think the average second grader knows? Well, average vocabulary increases from an estimated 3,500 root word meanings at the beginning of kindergarten to 6,000 root words at the end of second grade. Think about your typical intermediate student. How many new word meanings do you think that student learns to recognize each year? Well, a student will typically learn between 3,000 and 4,000 new words each year. And in an upcoming slide, you're going to learn that as teachers, we can directly and explicitly teach around 400 words. So how do you think those students are going to learn additional word meanings? Through wide reading, of course. How many new words do you think you learn each year? Well, there's really no answer to that question because it all depends on the amount of reading that you're doing and, of course, the type of reading. Now, again, coming back to why we are focusing on vocabulary. As I already stated, in the early 2000s, the National Reading Panel identified vocabulary instruction as an essential component of reading instruction, and it continues to be seen as an essential component through all of our science of reading research. There is a large body of research that indicates vocabulary knowledge plays a huge role in reading comprehension, and the Common Core state standards support that, making the requirement to acquire and use accurately a range of general academic and domain-specific words and phrases an anchor standard at both the elementary and secondary levels. However, here are the facts. We know that many children face a large deficit in their English vocabulary knowledge upon entrance throughout their elementary school years. It has been found that there is as much as a 30 million word gap between different students entering school. And unfortunately, without direct explicit instruction, schooling has largely been unable to eliminate this deficit. And children who are behind in grade 1 often have a hard time making up that gap. We know that a deficit in vocabulary knowledge represents a major obstacle to academic achievement. And we know that the chief cause of the achievement gap between socioeconomic groups is often a language gap, which goes back to vocabulary. If we want our students to enjoy reading, then they need to understand what they read. And they need to know 90% of words in a passage in order to understand what they read. Therefore, a focus on vocabulary is key. When you focus on vocabulary, did you know that reviews of research on vocabulary instruction stress the ineffectiveness of instruction that focuses on dictionary definitions? I want you to think about the last time that you used a dictionary. I remember once showing students how to use a dictionary and looking up the word happiness, only to be faced with the definition, the quality of being happy. That really wasn't very helpful. Research supports instruction that presents words in a variety of contexts with multiple exposures and students' active processing of new meaning. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. And I'm wondering if you realize that it takes 8 to 10 exposures to truly know a word and hold it in your long-term memory so that you can understand it when reading and use it in your writing. Now, we talked about the ineffectiveness of dictionary definitions. However, I will say that the Collins Co-Build Dictionary is an excellent source for student-friendly definitions on which you can build as you're teaching vocabulary. A few more interesting facts about vocabulary. First grade vocabulary predicts a student's reading achievement their junior year of high school. I'm wondering if you knew that high knowledge third graders have vocabularies equal to lowest performing 12th graders. And so again, what can we do to support all learners? We can directly and explicitly teach about 400 new words per year to support our students in improving their word knowledge and thus improving their comprehension, which will help us to close that gap. Now, as we talk about vocabulary, I want to make sure that we're all thinking about it in the same way. The term vocabulary refers to a word's known meaning, not necessarily being able to decode a word in print. And as I stated earlier, there is a difference between our expressive and receptive vocabulary. We can understand many more words through reading and listening than we can use in our speaking and writing. We've already stated a number of times that vocabulary is highly correlated with reading comprehension, which is why we have the focus on vocabulary today. And we know that students should learn a few thousand new words per year, but that teachers can only teach some of them. Students will learn the rest of them through reading, through listening, and through incidental learning. And as mentioned earlier, differences in word knowledge are established prior to school, oftentimes by age 3. And if we want to close that gap and accelerate learning, we must be very intentional in the words that we teach. And again, as Isabel Beck said, and I've already mentioned, we want to directly explain the meaning of new words and include thought-provoking, playful, and interactive follow-up. But first of all, how do we choose the words that we're going to be sharing with our students? Well, we must identify words that we think our students will not know. And while that seems pretty obvious, oftentimes in schools, teachers are presented with a curriculum where vocabulary words are already chosen for you. And teachers might think that they need to teach those words whether or not the students know the meaning of them already. I'm going to tell you that if your students know the meaning of those words, you do not need to take the time to teach them. You instead want to focus on words that you think your students do not know. And we need to be intentional in the words that we choose, and we need to know about the 3 tiers or 3 categories when thinking about instruction in the area of vocabulary. We can think of vocabulary as either falling in a tier 1, a tier 2, or a tier 3 category. Tier 1 words are described as common, basic, everyday words such as baby, clock, or table. Most of our students will know the meaning of those words, and if they don't, we can oftentimes point to that object to help them understand it. Tier 2 words are words that are more academic, and they are used in texts across multiple contexts. They're more mature words that our students might not hear as often in oral vocabulary. And tier 3 words are academic words that are discipline specific and very narrow in their usage. You do need to address tier 3 words in your instruction, maybe to understand a topic or a unit of study, but the word that falls into a tier 3 category is a word that may not be widely used, and you won't be using it beyond that unit. So teach its meaning for that unit, but don't necessarily spend all day, every day, ensuring that your students own that word. So what does this mean? Which words am I focusing? I am focusing on tier 2 words. It is in our best interest to focus on these words because they will be seen across grade levels and content areas. And as I said, they are more mature words. Oftentimes, students know a more common word that relates to a tier 2 word. For instance, I could teach a word such as content because my students know the word happy and they can make a connection between those 2 words. Or I can teach gigantic since students already know the word big, and I can explain to them that if something is gigantic, it is really big. What you want to do is choose words that are critical for understanding the text that you're going to be sharing with your students. Those can be single words or pairs of words or phrases. Again, you want to choose words for which students have a concept and know another, more common word, such as content related to happy or gigantic related to big. As I said, you want to choose words that will be seen across grades and content areas. And you might want to focus on only 3 to 5 words per reading selection with a goal of being 400 words per year. A great example of a tier 2 word is the word reluctant. That is a word that's a little bit more mature, but I have an easier concept that I can attach it to. I can help my students know that if you are reluctant to do something, you are not willing. And I know that's a good tier 2 word because I know that I might use that word in social studies if I'm talking about George Washington being reluctant to send his troops into battle. Or I might see that word in a science classroom where maybe I'm talking about Einstein being reluctant to give up his theory. Or I might hear that word in an ELA class where we're talking about a character being reluctant to do something. So I know that that's a word that can be attached to a more common word, and I know that it's a word that my students will see across content areas through the years. Further questions that you can ask when you are trying to choose tier 2 words. Which words are most important to understanding the text that you're about to use with your students? How much prior knowledge will students have about this word? Is this a word that they will encounter frequently? Is this a word that might have multiple meanings where I want to ensure that my students understand the meaning for the way that the word is being used in the text. Which strategies can I employ to help my students integrate the word into their lives? And how can I make those repeated exposures, 8 to 10, repeated exposures to the word productive and enjoyable and engaging? And how can I help students use the word in meaningful ways across contexts? Well, once I ask myself questions and choose a word, I am going to make sure that I go through steps such as the ones that you see on the screen. I am going to want to pronounce and read the word for my students. So I'm going to say to my students, the new word that we're focusing on is enormous. Enormous. Everybody say that with me, a syllable at a time. Enormous. I'm going to tell my students what the word enormous means. It means something that's very large or very big. I'm going to say more about the word, using it several times while elaborating its meaning. When I was traveling, I couldn't help but notice the enormous Grand Teton Mountains. Or, I am so hungry, I could eat an enormous plate of spaghetti. Or, since I love ice cream so much, I eat an enormous bowl of it every night. I'm going to say more about the word, using it several times while elaborating its meaning. And I'm going to ask questions about the word's meaning, such as, what is the word that means really big? What does the word enormous mean? Would you rather eat an enormous plate of pasta or an enormous plate of chicken fingers? And then I'm going to elicit word use by the students. If what I say is enormous, say enormous with your hands stressed out. If not, don't say anything at all. A football field. Enormous. A dandelion. A grain of sand. The Grand Tetons. Enormous. The Statue of Liberty. Enormous. You can see that I'm being engaging and getting my students to be interactive as we discuss the word enormous. There are some other really engaging ways that you can practice learning words with your students. So one activity that I like is Have You Ever? After teaching the word urge, which means to encourage or recommend do something, you can play Have You Ever? Have you ever had the urge to have someone try a new food? Or excuse me, have you ever had to urge someone to try a new food? I had to urge the toddler to try his peas. What is something that somebody had to urge you to do? Which would is another fun one. After introducing a word such as anticipate, which means looking forward to something, you can ask, which would you rather anticipate, your birthday or a dentist appointment? And of course, you want to follow that question up with why. Some students might anticipate a dentist appointment because they like the feeling of their clean teeth, whereas other students might say that they're anticipating their birthday because there's a gift that they're really hoping that they get. Questions, reasons, examples. This is another fun activity that you can do with your students. Perhaps I've just shared the word cautiously with my students, and I've told them that when you move cautiously, you act carefully. So I might say, if you are walking around a dark room, you need to do it cautiously. That's my example. Can somebody tell me why? And hopefully they will be able to explain that. Relating words is another really fun one. If you've taught a number of words to your students, you're going to sit back and look through those words that you've taught and see if there is something that they all have in common. For instance, I'm going to relate the words reluctant, insisted, and drowsy. And I'm going to help my students understand that all three of those words can be expressed through facial expressions. And I might ask my students to show me how they would look if they felt reluctant to do something. I might ask them to tell me how they might look if they were insisting someone do something. I might ask them to show me with their face how they would look if they were feeling drowsy. I'm helping my students know that all three of those words can be demonstrated through facial expression. One context for all words is another really fun one to do. Again, if I've taught a number of words, I'm going to sit back and think, how can I share these words in one context with my students? Let's take the words immense, miserable, and leisurely, and listen to the questions that I'm going to ask you. We're going to talk about spaghetti. And I am going to ask my students, what would an immense plate of spaghetti look like? And my guess is they're going to show me with their hands that it would be piled high. I might then ask, why might you feel miserable after eating all of that spaghetti? And they might put their hands over their bellies and show me that they're really full. And then I might ask, what would it look like to eat all of that spaghetti in a leisurely way? And they might show me that they're slowly going to put some spaghetti on their fork and lift it up. And finally, we have more or less likely. Perhaps the word that I'm focusing on is dawdle. And we know that the word dawdle means to waste time. So I might ask my students, would you be more likely or less likely to dawdle on your way to soccer practice? And again, what's key here is by following up with the question, why? If students love soccer practice, they might tell me they would be less likely to dawdle. If students are kind of over soccer and they're looking forward to the next sport, they might tell me that they're more likely to dawdle. Or maybe if they forgot their cleats, they would be more likely to dawdle. Would they be less or more likely to dawdle when their mom asked them to help bring in the groceries? Why? I have one child who would be less likely to dawdle because he would want to see what I purchased so that he could eat it. I have another child who would be more likely to dawdle because he's more interested in what he's doing in the living room. Would you be more likely or less likely to dawdle when the fire alarm goes off? Why? And would you be more likely or less likely to dawdle on your way to math class? Why? You'll notice that each of those activities require students to really think about the meaning of that word in a context so that they can better understand that word. Now, speaking of context, we know that oftentimes we ask students to try to identify the meaning of a word by using context clues. But I want you to be cautionary about your use of having students use context clues because we know they are only accurate approximately 25% of the time. And that's because written language is far less effective for learning new word meanings than oral language. When an author writes something, he or she sometimes leaves out key pieces of information that might lead a student to a correct definition or meaning of a word. We also know that if we want our students to rely on context, they must read widely enough to encounter new words. And we know that understanding a word meaning through context oftentimes requires students to have skills that will allow them to infer word meanings. And struggling readers oftentimes have difficulty with inferencing. Now, if you are going to encourage your students to use context clues, you can certainly do that, but I would suggest that you teach to students the different types of context clues that they might encounter during their reading. First of all, there's a definition clue. This is where the word is defined directly in the text. Fairly easy. But sometimes the author uses what's called a description clue. Here, the word is described by information in the context so that the reader can figure out the meaning. An example would be for the word pollination, where the author might write, pollination occurs when a pollen grain from a male plant lands on the stigma of a female plant. And so he has described what pollination is. Another type of clue is a synonym clue. This is where a word that is similar to the target word is provided. For instance, if the target word is pores, the example sentence might be, water soaks into the ground pores or spaces among the fragments of soil. And so the author is using that word synonym, or excuse me, is using that word spaces as a synonym to the word pores. An author might use a comparison clue. Here, the target word is compared with other examples that are similar. So if I want my students to understand the word pupil as part of my eye, the sentence might say, light enters your eye through a pupil, which is like a small hole. And you can see that the author has done a comparison there. And sometimes the author will use what is called a contrast clue. And here, the target word is contrasted with another word, usually an antonym. So for instance, if my target word is compound, my sentence might be, unlike a compound, an element cannot be broken down into simple material. And of course, in an example clue, the author provides a word or words that are examples of the target word provided. If you want your students to use context clues, which we know are only accurate about 25% of the time, it's imperative that we teach the different types of context clues so that they can be on the lookout for them when they're reading. Now, other fun things that you can do in your classroom to keep your students focused on vocabulary and grow their knowledge. One of the things that I really enjoy doing is having my students rate their knowledge prior to me teaching new vocabulary words. So I might be reading the story, The Chocolate Touch, with my students, and I might pull out these 4 vocabulary words that I think I need to teach to my students. They all feel like tier 2 vocabulary words to me. I know that there are some fun and engaging and interactive activities that I can do, but I want to know, how well do my students already know these words? And so we're going to say, I share a word and you tell me, oh, I know that word well. I can tell you what it means. I can use it in a sentence. I can give you an example of it. Or, I've seen that word or I've heard it, but I'm not sure I could define it. I'm not sure I could really use it in a sentence. Or, I have no clue what that word means. Maybe I've heard it, but I'm not even sure that I've heard it. And we're just going to rate our knowledge. 3 fingers, I know it well. 2 fingers, I've seen or heard it. 1 finger, I have no clue. I can then share the words with my students, and it will give me a better understanding of how much instruction I need to provide as I help my students to learn these tier 2 words. Another thing that I can do is focus on those multiple meaning words. We know, especially for our multilingual learners, that multiple meaning words can get in the way of comprehension. If I know that word check and I only know it as a way of payment, and I'm reading a story about hockey and I'm learning about a player checking another player, I might be totally confused about the sentence or the happenings in the story. And so there are so many words in our English language that don't just have 1 or 2 meanings, but they have multiple meanings. These are words that we're going to want to spend some time teaching our students. So there are a few things to keep in mind. If I am reading that book where the word check is being used as a move in hockey, I might share the meaning of check as being a move in hockey and not share other meanings at that time. I might go back to that word at a later time, however, and say, by the way, did you know that the word check has other meanings besides a move in hockey? Let's talk together about the different ways that we might see the word check used when we are reading a story. Other really fun words to focus on are words like spring, which we know can be a metal coil or a season. It can also be an action. We know pitch is a word that has more than 2 meanings. We know that stuff is a word that has more than 1 or 2 meanings. And we know that run is a word that has more than 1 or 2 meanings. These are all great words to start off with to really focus on those multiple meaning words. And of course, there are so many more in the English language. This is just a short list to get you started. The other thing that you can do is think about your word choice in the classroom as a teacher. Sometimes I feel like I say the same thing to my students over and over and over, whether it be as simple as the direction, please line up, or whether it be where I have to ask my students, who broke this pencil? And so it would be kind of interesting to see how your students might react if you think about your word choice when you ask your students to do something. So for instance, my students are used to me saying, please line up. I wonder what they would do if I said, please create a linear formation perpendicular to the door. I'm really asking them to line up, but I'm doing it using more robust vocabulary so that I can grow their vocabulary. They're going to stop and they're going to think, and together we're going to dissect that sentence, and they're going to understand that when I say, please create a linear formation perpendicular to the door, I'm basically asking them to please line up. How many times do we ask our students to raise their hand before speaking? What might be a different way that we could ask that? I might say, please elevate your appendage and wiggle your phalange before orating your answer to my question. And of course, you might do something similar with a question such as, who broke this pencil? Have fun with language. When students see you having fun with vocabulary, they're going to start having fun with vocabulary. Now, many of us in the world of education have seen the Freyer model as a graphic organizer that we can use to help our students fully understand the meaning of a word. And there are different ways that we can structure or organize a Freyer model graphic organizer. Here is one example where we're going to take our target tier 2 word. Eager is a word that I might see across content areas, across grades. And when I'm sharing this word with my students, we're going to put the word in the center of our graphic organizer. And in the left-hand corner, we're going to provide a student-friendly definition that I'm probably going to pull from the Collins Co-Build Dictionary. A student-friendly definition for eager might be very much wanting to do or have something. We're then going to shift over to the right-hand side of that graphic organizer, and we're going to put some synonyms or words that mean the same or have a similar meaning to the word eager. And we might include words like willing or wanting. We're going to move below the definition and put some words that are opposite, some antonyms, such as unwilling or hesitant. And we're going to work together with our students to create a sentence using that target word. My sentence might be, I was eager to fly to Italy for vacation because I heard the food was amazing. And of course, I want my students to be able to illustrate that word on the back. So here you can see this graphic organizer has a spot for a synonym, an antonym, and a sentence. Whereas here's a different version of that Freyer model graphic organizer. This time, my word is boisterous. Again, I'm going to put my word in the center. And again, I'm going to have a student-friendly definition that I've probably taken from the Collins Co-Build Dictionary, which is noisy or loud or crazy. Some facts or characteristics about the word boisterous. I might help my students understand that that word is an adjective. And I might help them understand that when somebody is described as being boisterous, they're probably wild or rowdy. And then I want them to think, what would it look like if someone was boisterous? Or give me an example of a time where you've seen people acting in a boisterous way. And we might think about 10 7-year-olds at Chuck E. Cheese for a birthday party. And what would be a non-example? Well, that would be something very different, and that might be relaxing on a hammock in the backyard. And of course, you can see we could put a sentence and an illustration on the back. And this would be a way for my students to fully be studying that word boisterous, which I would consider a tier 2 word because they have a more common word that they can attach to it. And I think that's a word that I might see across grades and content areas. Another really important thing to do is help your students focus on the precision of the vocabulary words that they see and that they use. So let's think about writing instruction. Have you ever asked students to write to a prompt and notice that they're using the same word over and over and over? And so you might ask your students, how many times did I circle the same word in your writing? That tells me that you're using that same word too much. That word that we sometimes see circled over and over is the word said. And we might ask our students, what are some other words that we've seen in books that we've read? What are some other words that we can use to share that the character said something? The character yelled, the character exclaimed, the character shouted, hollered, cried, whispered, mumbled, uttered, remarked, mentioned, spoke, announced, claimed. All of these different ways that we can share that word said. And they all have just a slightly different meaning, and that will help our students get to that precision of vocabulary. Do you want the reader to think that the character exclaimed? Or do you want the reader to think that the character merely mentioned? Or do you want the reader to think that the character mumbled those words. Each of those words have a slightly different shade of meaning. Which one will get your message most clearly across? And of course, there are other words that we sometimes refer to as tired words in our language, words that are overused, such as old and big. And these are words that are very easy to start with. Even our youngest of learners will oftentimes have other words that mean the same or similar, where we could start a nice chart instead of saying sad and keep that list, instead of the word old and keep that list, instead of saying big and keep that list. What a great way for students to grow their vocabulary. And if you keep those charts in your room, you'll be amazed at the number of students who will bounce in on a Monday morning and say, I thought of a new word that we can add to our chart to share the word big, or to share a word that means similar to big. And of course, another way to get to that precision of vocabulary is by teaching what we call gradient words. These are words that seem to be opposite in meaning, and yet they're very opposite, such as hot and cold. But when I think about hot, I think that there are words that mean even hotter than hot. And when I think of cold, I think of words that are even colder than cold. And when I think of hot and cold, I think there are some words that could describe maybe the weather somewhere between being hot and cold. And I can do the same thing with words such as angry and delighted, or happy and sad. And so what I want to do is I want my students to understand that there are other words in their vocabulary that they can use. Is it hot out, or is it blistering out? Is it cold out, or is it frigid out? Is it really hot, or is it just warm? Is it really cold, or is it just cool? Let's talk about that precision of vocabulary. Where would all of these different words fit on a continuum? Would I say blistering, hot, warm, cool, cold, frigid? Well, how can we help our students to really get to that precision of vocabulary by using gradient words? We can do it in a hands-on, interactive way with either index cards, clothespins, or popsicle sticks. So you can see on my index cards on the screen, I started with those words cold, hot, and there are a variety of words on the other index cards that have similar meanings to either cold or hot. They're either beyond cold, beyond hot, or somewhere in the middle. How fun would it be to have a small group of students working with those words and laying those index cards out in order so we have hot, cold, anything beyond hot, anything beyond cold, and whatever comes in the middle. And the value of using those index cards is that we can easily move them. There's no pencil and paper and eraser involved. Maybe I don't want to use index cards. Instead, I could use clothespins. And when I use clothespins, I bring in a piece of ribbon that we can pinch those clothespins onto. And here you can see that we started with the words happy and sad, and there are a variety of words that mean beyond happy, beyond sad, and there might be some words that are in the middle of happy and sad. And so again, putting students in a small group and having them discuss the meaning of those words and where they fit on a continuum is a great exercise. Students are thinking about words, they're discussing, they're justifying their reason for where they place a word. And truly, at the end of the day, does it really matter if unhappy and disappointed are placed in a certain order? Can we agree to disagree? What's super exciting is that students are having discussions about those words, and they're thinking about the meaning of those words and where they think they fit on a continuum. And then, of course, if you don't want to use index cards or clothespins, you can use popsicle sticks. So here we started with small and large, and you can see that we have words that mean beyond large, words that mean beyond small, and words that might go in the middle. And again, really easy for students to manipulate those popsicle sticks and move them so that they end up on a continuum. Morphology. We haven't talked about morphology. This is probably one of the most efficient ways to teach vocabulary to your students, focusing on base words or root words, prefixes, and suffixes. The reason that it's so efficient, if I teach the prefix UN, meaning not, I can help my students understand that the word unkind means not kind. And if they know that UN means not, they know that untied means not tied. And they know that unhappy means not happy. If I teach the suffix NESS as the quality of being, they know that when somebody shows kindness, they are being kind. They know that when somebody shows happiness, they are feeling happy. So once I teach the meaning of a prefix or a suffix, it opens the door to understanding so many other words in the English language. And then, of course, thinking about roots and base words. Roots especially. Let's think about that root port. The root port means to carry. Once my students understand that, they can understand that an import is a good that gets carried into the country, and an export is a good that gets carried out of the country. They might understand that a portfolio is a folder that I carry, and they might even understand that a porta potty is a potty that gets carried from various locations. Understanding prefixes, suffixes, and root words opens the door to learning so many other words in the English language. Great use of your time. Really fun to focus on what's called the morpheme of the month. So here you can see a bulletin board that was created in my school at the first grade hallway. So in the first grade, our teachers focused on the suffix FUL, meaning full of. And they asked students, they gave students a few examples of words that had that suffix, and they asked students to then brainstorm additional words with that suffix and to then work together with a partner to construct sentences using that word to share its meaning. And you can see that those words were then typed up and put on the morpheme of the month tree. And the students were so proud when they walked by that tree to see their work hanging up for all other students to see. It's a great way to energize your environment and focus on vocabulary. Or perhaps you don't want to do a morpheme of the month, you could do an idiom of the month. Idioms are words that, again, many of our struggling learners don't quite understand because they're playful language. Multilingual learners will oftentimes struggle with the use of idioms. And so you could hang up an idiom of the month. You can see behind me that I have some idioms hanging up that we have worked on in my school that I'm currently working at. And if you don't want to do an idiom of the month, you could actually create a fun learning activity for students to do with a partner or a small group, where maybe you put some idioms that you think your students may have heard, been exposed to, and then their meaning, and see if they can match the idiom to its meaning. Notice that they're color coded, where the idioms are on white cards and the meanings are on pink cards. And that's just a way to support your students as they're trying to put the idioms together with their meaning. And maybe you don't want to do an idiom of the month. Maybe you want to focus on the riddle of the month. Why are we focusing on riddles when we're talking about vocabulary? Because oftentimes riddles have a play on words. They help students to start thinking about our language, and they're a way to keep vocabulary learning fun. And really, that's what learning should be. And so I'm curious to know if any of you watching know the answer to my riddle on the screen. My riddle is, what has to be broken before you can use it? Did anybody guess an egg? If you did, you're correct. Again, energizing the environment, having fun with language. And of course, we live during a time where assessment is very important in the world of education. And so if we want our students to be successful, it would behoove us to focus a little bit on vocabulary that students will see on assessments. We certainly don't want our students to do poorly on an assessment because they didn't understand the vocabulary words in the task that they're being asked to complete. So you could create a bulletin board in your classroom or in your school where you are encouraging your students to be a word wizard. And here you're going to get all members of your school community involved. So at the beginning of the week, you can share the word of the week and have your school secretary state that word over the intercom. And they're going to state the student-friendly definition. So for instance, we might say this week, we're going to be a word wizard and we're going to listen for the word claim. A claim is a statement that we believe is true. Stay tuned until tomorrow, where we share a sentence using the word claim. And on the next day, we're going to share that word again and its student-friendly definition, but we're going to follow it up with a fun, engaging sentence. So every year, Mrs. Callahan claims that she is celebrating her 29th birthday. Mrs. Callahan being a teacher in the school who has clearly celebrated her 29th birthday more than once. And then the following day, we might share that word again with its student-friendly definition and a new sentence. Mr. S claims that he is so strong he can lift a car with one hand. That is a statement that Mr. S makes that he believes is true. And we can continue on that week sharing sentences with our students and then encouraging them to share sentences with us in hopes that one of their sentences is going to get stated over the intercom for the whole school to hear. Energizing the environment, focusing on words, being interactive and engaging. Everything that I've shared with you today has come from the resources that you see on the screen. Isabel Beck, along with Margaret McCune and Linda Kukan, wrote the book Bringing Words to Life. Michael Graves wrote the vocabulary book, so aptly named. Joan Sedita wrote the Key Vocabulary Routine. And of course, the National Center on Improving Literacy and the National Reading Panel are very well-known publications that share much of the information that you heard today. I'd like to thank you so much for hanging out with me for the past 45 minutes or so. Another way to say that, with much appreciation, feeling grateful, and I'm much obliged. If you have any questions about anything that you heard today and would like to contact me, you can see my email on the screen, jpompi@baypath.edu. Thank you again for your time.